go ahead, we'll get started. It's about 1:04 now. And so I am excited to introduce Captain Nick Onken. He's going to be our presenter for today. Prior to Captain speaking, we're going to have Dr. Rosenbaum give a quick didactic. For those that have not been on Scion before, Dr. Rosenbaum will talk about a certain topic for about 10 minutes, and then our presenter will begin, and then you guys can write questions or comments in the chat throughout, or at the end you can unmute and you can ask those questions as well. And we'll talk about that before we switch over to Captain Nick as well. With that, we'll go ahead and turn the time over to you, Doc.
Great, thank you. I will share my screen. There. Okay. All right, thanks everybody. So today we're going to talk about cumulative trauma. This just means trauma that builds up. Okay, so regular trauma reactions. So if anybody's faced with a trauma, they're going to get fight, flight, or freeze because it's an anxiety provoking. And it doesn't even have to be a trauma to have that, but the sweating, the heart rate, other things that can go along with the serious trauma, psychological trauma, are dissociation. So feeling like you don't belong, or you're coming out of your body, or things feel unreal, or you might actually panic and feel like you're losing control. You could actually, in very extreme cases, lose control of your body. Time sort of warps is very typical. Things sort of slow down and become very vivid. So that's when facing a trauma. What we would think of as a major trauma. So for studies, what are among the most traumatic situations for police? And I'll pause for a second to let a couple people type in. What do you think, like if you had to rank things, and this is not a rank, this is a smattering, but what do you think are among the most stressful things cops can go through in their job?
Officer-involved shootings?
Officer-involved shootings is there, but it's actually, interestingly enough, on this list, it's not there. Because the shooting itself is not what makes it traumatic. It has to have some other ingredients. Any other guesses?
What about traffic wrecks?
Traffic wrecks?
Patricia St. Ange said child deaths.
Child death is definitely on the list. I mean, these are the big ones. So I'll just tell you. Being present when a coworker was killed intentionally or accidentally. Like, can't get much worse than that. But yes, it gets worse. Being held hostage. Being in a life-threatening, large-scale, man-made disaster. Man-made is key, because if it's just a hurricane and dying, then you know that's it's not as traumatic, because a lot of the trauma comes from the willfulness of it. Making a mistake on the job that injures or kills a coworker, being taken hostage, or death of children. So an officer-involved shooting could be present in any of those. So some officer-involved shootings are not that traumatic. I mean, they're all very traumatic, but they're not in the highest echelon. Okay, so those are the kind of things where you might dissociate and have all sorts of weird things. So cumulative stress is just builds up, ticks, and just builds up. So one of the problems with cumulative stress is that the reason I'm making this distinction is cumulative stress, it doesn't have to be a man-made disaster, and then you're taken hostage. It can be just a lot of little subtle things, or a few officer-involved shootings that you think weren't such a big deal because it was really a bad guy and you shot your bullet and someone else actually killed him, and you know, that. And I hear this a lot as a therapist. Oh, it's just part of the job. I haven't had any real trauma, because when cops think of real trauma, they think of that list I just. So cumulative stress is potentially as problematic as one of these major traumas that we listed. So it just keeps coming. It's stressful events create high levels of stress, especially if they're not dealt with effectively. So you need to purge them. You need to talk about them. You need to deal with it some way or another. And there are good ways to that chronic stress. Cumulative stress reactions are less dramatic, like what I was talking about, more gradual form of a acute stress. So you're not constantly getting that big rush, or you didn't panic, or none of those things happen. But they can still lead to PTSD. But they lack that specific trigger, which leads up to a whole other diagnostic and problem with getting disability and those kind of things. It's like, which date was your trauma? You're like, how about this one, this one, this one, this one, this one? And you just kind of have to pick one. But that's not how life works, nor how the brain works. So what are some of the cumulative stress reactions? So this is sort of the goes into PTSD, elevated cortisol, so that can cause weight gain, trouble sleeping, anxiety, irritability, sleeplessness, feeling detached, separated from people, burned out, avoiding places that remind you of traumas, just being negative and irritable, and being on edge, hypervigilant. So these kind of things can happen when it's just that drip, 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 and that can lead to PTSD. And obviously the frog references, it's just a slow boil of cumulative trauma. You don't realize it. And this gradual buildup may be because of the relentlessness, that slow boil, the inability to escape. You can't just like, I'm not going to take that call. Well, I guess sometimes, yeah, some say overall calls to take, but you can't just not go to work for long stretches. And also, often the most rewarding parts of your job involve trauma. That's just what's expected. And often it just goes unnoticed or unacknowledged, like the frogs in the water, or that's not really true. Then undoing, I kind of threw in there, that's a psychological, old psychological term, which means, say you've been through a trauma where someone got hurt and you feel guilty in some way. So now you want to take every call that kind of reminds you of that, either consciously or subconsciously, because this time I'm going to do it right. And so undoing is sending you back to do the trauma over and over to make it right. And it generally doesn't work because you're just exposed to more trauma. Okay, cumulative trauma can lead to PTSD symptoms. And that final straw thing can happen. I was fine. I don't know why this one call is driving me crazy. It wasn't that bad a call. You know, like it was a kid who was hurt, he wasn't even killed, and I don't know why I can't get it out of my mind. It's sort of that straw that breaks the camel's back. And it's the integrity of your wall that's keeping you from all that trauma is starting to give way. And that's why I have a picture of a dam. The dam that's holding your psyche is starting to drip. And what you need to do is purge a little. You need to open the gates a little and talk about this stuff with friends, coworkers, with your family. If you keep it all dammed up, it might work for a little while, or the levee might break. And then you have, this is not how it always works, but this is just an analogy. Okay, here are the criteria for PTSD. So negative thinking, negative mood, being hypervigilant has to last. Has to come on after a month and last for a month. Avoidance, so you avoid places that remind you of the trauma. Intrusion, so you think about the trauma even though there's no reason to. And stressors that remind you of the trauma cause you to feel anxious. It used to be called an anxiety disorder. In my heart, it will always be anxiety disorder. So, and it has to cause some impairment. But what's tricky about this, a lot of them are like, I don't go to that place because that's where that terrible shooting happened and I avoid it. Okay, that's a PTSD symptom. But I just kind of avoid everything and I don't go out as much because of accumulative trauma, and now I just withdraw a little bit. Is a lot harder diagnostically, but it still can be devastating for the person going through it. And trauma can cause a shift in how we view the word meaning and reality in other people. So you come in as one person, you're exposed to all this trauma, and then you can be a different person. And here's a quote. I was taught that law enforcement work is dangerous, but I never realized it until I lost a close friend. I no longer trust anyone or any situation. That's an officer lawsuit. So cumulative stress can lead to PTSD, like an actual diagnosis. So these are just the different diagnostic criteria: intrusion, unwanted memories, nightmares, emotional and physical stress when you're reminded of the trauma. And this can be a hodgepodge. It's like in a specific thing, it's very clear. Every time I see a baby, I get nervous because it reminds me that baby gets hurt. But when it's just a hodgepodge of different stressors that built up, it can just kind of float on top of you and just build, and then all of a sudden you don't know why. avoidance, and I put movies. People sometimes just, I used to love to go to movies, now I don't like to go to that. Or this one is no longer diagnostic to me, but Walmart. I don't go to Walmart. It's just smart. But, okay, so negative alterations in conditions and moods. That's just a fancy way of saying you have a shitty mood and you think shitty things. So the world is bad, the future's bad, everything's bad, you're bad, leave me alone. That's sort of that whole cluster of symptoms explained in a nutshell. And then it leads to feeling isolated. Why you guys all feel isolated? You're all assholes. Where are you going? Hypervigilance, irritability, being on edge. This is the sort of classic, don't ever walk up behind a cop and tap him on the shoulder. And that's, you know, we laugh about it because we think, oh, that's normal. That's how a cop should be. Not really. You know, I mean, you should be that way because of the training. The training is giving you hypervigilance, which is not great. And if you bring it while you're at work and you can somehow shut it off as the moment you leave work, then it's not a problem at all. But no one can do that. And so it's just a matter of degree, how much of it before it becomes a problem. Difficulty concentrating, difficulty sleeping. But I wanted to end on a happy note. People get better. And I have a few slides that I'll run through very quickly about how people get better. Coping mechanisms like humor. This is a picture of a cop.
That is not humor.
It's a picture of a cop crying over Krispy Kreme being totally. Faith is obviously one. Telling stories, talking to your colleagues, telling your colleagues, telling other cops, you know, that was a scary call. It feels fucked up. It's keeping me up at night. If you're able to muster the courage to say that, it's going to be therapeutic to you and to them. Connecting with people, same idea. Doesn't have to be a shrink, doesn't have to be a therapist. It's somebody. You got to connect with someone. And then when you're faced with grief and loss, you did something that maybe you regret at work, or something bad happened to a friend, or someone actually died, you just have to face it and grieve. You have to live all those negative emotions. You can't dam them all up. There are not a lot of pictures of officers in distress, emotion. Surprising. Because you guys don't ever cry or have emotions. And then as you're going through dealing with trauma or grief, ask yourself periodically, and this is a good question to ask yourself periodically, all the time, always. This is helping you. What I'm doing useful. You're in the middle of a fight with your spouse. This is helping or hurting what I'm about to say. You know, should it be said? Should it be said by me? Should it be said by me now? Yeah. Allowing, accepting, supporting. So when other people open up to you, accept them, allow them to be there. That's a very nice photo. Again, allowing, accepting, supporting. When I first saw this, I thought, you know, that was a citizen. Huh, these are cops looking after each other. And the, you know, honestly, when I looked up these pictures, the ones you can get where it's allowed to cry. Where are you allowed to cry? You know,
Funerals.
It'll be mostly all. So those are all the strategies I just went over, and a few additional ones. Don't drink, even though it helps you fall asleep. It's going to fuck up your sleep in the long run. Live healthfully. Get help if you need it. Keep in a routine. Connect with others. Think.
So the question, is it helpful, or is it helping, or is it hurting? That question comes in mind when I'm exercising, like all the time.
Okay.
And it's always hurting. So do I just do it?
That's a good, I mean, it's an interesting analogy because sometimes that's how you can look at therapy. This hurts now, but I know overall it's helping. So you have to use your wise mind, you know, and we often don't engage our wise mind. Just like, this sucks, I'm stopping. And that's what causes PTSD, because I'm not going to that place. I'm not going to face this fear. This feels bad. So the question is it helping or hurting? Is it helping to avoid that spot? Probably not. It would be much better to go with a friend, talk about it with a friend, connect with somebody who's a lot better than you. That's a good question.
I was trying to be funny, but.
Oh, I just
Awesome. Thanks, Doc.
Yeah, my pleasure.
If anyone has any comments or questions for Doc, you can either put them in the chat or you can send us an email. You can send it to myself,